The year was 1305. In London, the streets echoed with vendors hawking their wares, the clatter of hooves on cobblestones, and the low murmur of everyday life. But on this August morning, a different sound would soon command the city's attention. The roar of a gathering crowd, hungry for spectacle and retribution. They had come with one purpose: to see the death of William Wallace, the Scottish knight, who had dared to defy the English crown and rally his people to resist. What would unfold that day was not a noble martyr's final stand. It was a theater of calculated cruelty, a public display of power intended to crush more than flesh and bone. It was designed to break a symbol. To understand Wallace's fate, we must first look at the world that shaped it. Scotland in the late 13th century was a land under pressure, torn between independence and imposed dominance. The English King Edward I, often called Longshanks, viewed Scotland not as a foreign nation, but as a rebellious province to be subdued. He had already asserted control over Wales and intervened deeply in Scottish politics. In Scotland, loyalty was fluid. Many nobles, weary of war and occupation, chose accommodation over ruin. Resistance had often meant destruction. Into this fragile world stepped William Wallace, not a great nobleman, but a landowner whose family had suffered under English rule and whose anger and conviction would transform him into a symbol. In 1297, Wallace and Andrew de Moray won a stunning victory at Stirling Bridge, proving that English heavy cavalry was not invincible. The emotional and symbolic power of that victory fueled the flame of resistance. But Edward I would not tolerate this flame spread. He pursued Wallace relentlessly, seeking not just to defeat him militarily, but to erase his example. Edward and his administration launched an expansive campaign to isolate Wallace. Spies, informants, coercion. The net gradually tightened. In August 1305, betrayal struck. Wallace was captured near Glasgow, likely at Robryston, by forces loyal, or forced, to Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight aligned with England. He was seized, bound, and put into English hands. The journey from Scotland to London was itself a kind of torment. Shackled, paraded, sometimes jeered at, transported through hostile lands. This was psychological warfare. The rebel hero was being transformed into a captive curiosity, stripped of dignity long before his final punishment. Wallace's trial was staged on 23rd August 1305 at Westminster Hall in London. It was a legal farce. The charges, treason, murder, sacrilege, arson, among others, were tailored to justify extreme punishment. Wallace was asked if he would plead. He famously responded, as tradition holds, that he could not be a traitor. He had never accepted Edward as his sovereign and had never sworn allegiance to him. In that moment, the theater took precedence over justice. The verdict was predetermined. The performance was about demonstrating power, not adjudicating guilt. Not long after the sentencing, Wallace was stripped, tied to a hurdle, a wooden frame or sledge, and dragged through London toward Smithfield. The route was deliberate, chosen to maximize humiliation and spectacle. Crowds lined the path, some threw refuse, stones, booze, taunts. The authorities encouraged the spectacle. By the time Wallace reached Smithfield, the crowd had grown to thousands. The city had rigged the execution ground for maximum effect. Vendors sold food and drink. It was a grotesque fair of death. What followed was the full horror of the traitor's punishment. Hanged, drawn and quartered, a sequence of torment intended to extend agony and maximize public terror. First, Wallace was hung, but not to kill him. The rope was adjusted so that strangulation would begin. But death would not come quickly. The aim was prolonged suffering. When he showed signs of life, he was cut down while still alive. This was intentional. The executioner moved to the next stage: disembowelment and burning of entrails. The organs were cut out, held before the crowd, and then thrown into a fire prepared at the scaffold. Some accounts also report emasculation, the removal of genitals as part of the humiliation. This element is part of some chroniclers' descriptions, though not all sources mention it. Through all this, witnesses claimed Wallace remained conscious, eyes open, enduring the agony. Some sources say he may have spoken, though we don't know what he said. Next came beheading. A single stroke of the axe ended his life. But even then, the spectacle was not complete. His body was quartered, divided into 4 parts, each limb severed. What remained was not simply disposal, it was display. His head was tarred to preserve it, and placed on a spike on London Bridge. His quarters were shipped to major Scottish and border towns, Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, Perth, for public exhibition. The severed body parts were warnings in physical form, each piece telling a story in its own right, placed where Scottish eyes could see. In the short term, Edward's plan appeared to succeed. Many Scots submitted, fearful of further brutality. Wallace's resistance seemed extinguished, but the spectacle backfired. The horror of his death inflamed Scottish sentiment. Wallace became a martyr, a rallying symbol across generations. Robert the Bruce, who would later become king, is said to have been moved by Wallace's fate to take up arms more decisively. In the long run, Wallace's execution did not extinguish resistance. It transformed it. His story fed into Scottish nationalism, cultural memory literature, rhetoric of liberty. The execution itself became part of the discourse of medieval justice. It served as a brutal benchmark for state violence and the limits of sovereignty. Future scholars, legal thinkers, and humanitarians would point to punishments like Wallace's as evidence of the need for restraint and the protection of dignity, even in enemies. Hollywood likes to portray Wallace's death as a quick, heroic sacrifice, a man who died bravely, swiftly surrounded by sweeping ideals. But the historical record tells another story. Many dramatic elements in popular accounts come from Blind Harry, a 15th century minstrel whose poem, The Actes and Deities of the Illustre and Valiant, Campion Sir William Wallace, written over a century after Wallace's death, is more legend than eyewitness testimony. Medieval chronicles, pipe rolls, legal accounts, and administrative records offer more sober, but also more brutal insight. For example, the Exchequer pipe rolls, for 1304 to 05, record the cost of Wallace's execution in English accounting detail. The ledger notes payments for moving William, Wallace's quartered body parts, and describes the sentence. Drawn, hanged, beheaded, his entrails burned, and his body quartered. These records show that even clerks found Wallace's punishment exceptional enough to document in detail beyond the norm. Thus, Wallace's death was not a clean martyrdom. It was agony, humiliation, dismemberment, and a warning. Wallace's dismembered remains, a head in London, limbs in Scottish towns became symbols of English dominance and Scottish resistance at once. The brutality attempted to intimidate, but instead etched Wallace's memory into the conscience of Scotland. Over centuries, his story inspired ballads, poetry, monuments, and in modern times, films. He became not only a warrior, but a legend, a symbol of freedom and defiance. The paradox is stark. The very act intended to erase him instead immortalized him. His execution also underscores how power uses spectacle to terrorize, to dominate the public imagination, to broadcast the consequences of defiance. And yet symbols once ignited can transcend their creators. When we look back across 700 years, Wallace's execution remains chilling not only in its physical horror, but in what it reveals about power, cruelty, and memory. State violence, even when legal, is a weapon. Public spectacle amplifies its reach. Public humiliation destroys more than bodies. It aims at dignity and morale. Our modern sensibilities recoil at such brutality, but we must remember that medieval societies accepted, even normalized, such punishments. What seems monstrous to us was once a tool of governance. We must also ask, how do we remember such events? Through myth, through narrative, through selective memory. How do we guard against sanitizing horror into heroism? William Wallace's final hours were not filmed in sweeping epics, but they were seared into the record, the memory, and the identity of a nation. On that August day in 1305, London bore witness to more than an execution. It bore witness to a calculated demonstration of violence, humiliation, and power. The English crown sought to crush not just a man, but a symbol. They failed. For though the body was torn apart, the spirit of resistance survived. We remember William Wallace not because he died cleanly or heroically, but because his death was horrific. And in its horror, it became a call across centuries. A warning, a sorrow, a hope. The cobblestones of medieval London still echo, The price of conscience, of freedom, is sometimes steep, but the human spirit endures.